Eric, trained in the sciences, you live a materialistic intellectual life, which I hope is not correct. But I'm not going to fool myself. And so I look at the world and say, what are the ways that materialism could be defeated? And the best, maybe the only one that I see as a possible one, is consciousness. Yet many people feel that consciousness is fully material. As a philosopher, you've dealt with consciousness in peripheral areas. Does consciousness defeat materialism?
I don't think it defeats materialism. I think it's possible that materialism is not true. I'm about 50-50 on materialism myself. I think
that's rare, actually, for somebody to really be honest and open and saying, I'm really in the middle, sitting on that fence.
I find that fact interesting, actually. It seems like a lot of philosophers, they're either gung-ho materialists and they're highly confident it's true, right? Or they don't like materialism and they've got some other view that they're highly confident is true. I mean, maybe if you weren't highly confident, you wouldn't go into philosophy. You just do something else, right? Or you go into some other part of philosophy. But I guess I find myself on the fence. I started as a materialist, and I still kind of my basic instincts, I think, my first reactions tend to be materialist. And I don't think that the mere existence of consciousness refutes materialism. I think that there are materialist explanations on the table for it that might work. I also think there are problems with those explanations, and I think there are alternative views out there that might also work and that we can't decisively refute.
Walk me through your chronology. You started out as a materialist, and that's still a first inclination, but it sounds like you were totally a materialist, and now you've moved from 95-5 or whatever to 50-50.
Yeah.
What caused that transition?
I think it was caused by reflecting on our poor epistemic situation with respect to settling questions of metaphysics. So I think there are basically three ways that you can approach the metaphysics of consciousness. You can do it with science, you can do it with common sense, you can do it with things like theoretical elegance, right? So those are kinds of the tools that we come with. What makes sense kind of intuitively? What do the brain readouts tell us? And what kind of seems like the most elegant, simple explanation? But none of those things seem to me like they decisively settle among the various options. So partly, it's my reflection upon what I think of as the relative impoverishment of our tools for settling these questions. But also, and this is going to sound a little funny.
If it doesn't sound funny, it can't be right when you deal with consciousness.
But I think kind of for me, I was already heading this direction, but kind of for me, maybe the last straw was reading Nick Bostrom's simulation argument. I don't know if you know this stuff.
Sure.
Right, so the idea that we might be computer programs in an artificial simulated environment. Now, Bostrom thinks it's about maybe 1/3 chance that that's true.
I think it's higher than that, actually.
So, I don't know exactly what my degree of belief is in that. I probably wouldn't go as high as that myself, but I think it's certainly possible. And if that's the case, then when I look out at the world, what I'm seeing is something that has been presented, has been kind of constructed for me by the computer in which we're being instantiated.
But that's a wholly materialistic world.
No.
Why?
I disagree with that. Does computation have to be material? I don't see why. Maybe it has to be temporal. I'm not even sure about that. But, right, so here's one thing I think is, if something is not spatial, it's not material. That's, I guess, my inclination. I'm just going to build that into the definition of materialism, right? Computation doesn't have to be spatial. Space might be a feature of our programming environment, if you accept this, that we're computer simulations possibility seriously. Space might be a feature of our programming environment that doesn't reflect the fundamental nature of reality. Maybe the fundamental nature of reality is God's mind is a computer transitioning through different kinds of, through a Turing table, right? Different kinds of conditional computational possibilities. There's nothing about Turing tables, I think, that has to be spatial. So,
But you can be material without being spatial.
How so?
Well, I mean, the example that you're giving of a computer program is, at least in our world, is composed of bits of information in two different states. And those states can be in different forms, and that form is information. And is that and that information is resident someplace.
So it has to be, I think, concrete in the sense that it's not merely an abstract thing like a number.
Right. But
that doesn't mean.
But the simulation argument, the simulation has to be someplace. It's not a Platonic.
It's not Platonic, but I don't think that means that it has to be in space, right? So if you think about, so Hilary Putnam, for example, said, look, you could have immaterial souls implementing a Turing table.
Right.
Many people who've thought about immateriality, like Descartes, thought that souls are not the kinds of things that have spatial position.
Correct. Yes.
Right? So if a soul is something, I think maybe you have to have temporal transitions. Maybe there's a way to avoid that, or I'm not sure. But if a soul is a thing that does not have a spatial position, but does have temporal transitions and informational states, right? So if you accept a Cartesian immaterialism, right, presumably the soul contains information, it can think, right? That's a kind of information. So you got information, you got temporal transitions.
Right.
That's probably enough for computation, even without space.
Okay.
So I'm calling this Kant meets cyberpunk.
Okay, I understand your transition away from a hardcore materialist to 50-50 sitting on that fence, along with me, by the way.
Yeah.
What's in that other 50%? What are the components of it that make up a non-materialist possible worldview?
Right. Well, I think there are four broad categories of metaphysical position. Right? So one, it would be materialism.
Okay.
But another would be substance dualism, right? The idea that there's an immaterial soul and a material world, and they're equally real and equally fundamental, and one is not reducible to the other, right? And that's a view that deserves some credence, I think.
Certainly, it's been a religious view in many different religions.
I find various forms of idealism also attractive, right? So on an idealist view, what's really fundamental are minds, right? So you could have a view like Berkeley's, where they're just our minds, maybe in interaction with each other and with God, right? Or you could have an atheistic version of that, where they're just our minds in interaction with each other.
Or a cosmic consciousness of sorts.
Right? I think another possibility is, I think there's a grab bag of other types of views that reject a kind of sharp dichotomy, or the sharp trichotomy between dualism, idealism, and materialism. So one would be neutral monism or property dualism of the sort advocated by Bertrand Russell or David Chalmers. Another possibility that I find attractive and I don't think has been getting enough attention in recent philosophy of mind is something like Kantian transcendental idealism.
And what is that?
So in transcendental idealism, space, at least, maybe time too, maybe causation, but let's just do it with space, right? Space is something that's constructed by or created by our minds, right? And not a fundamental to reality, kind of independent of us, right? Or maybe it is, but we don't know that it is, right? So there are different ways of playing this out. I guess I'm somewhat more inclined toward the skeptical view of this. So on transcendental idealism, we don't really know what the reality fundamentally is like, but there's no particularly good reason to think that it's spatial. It might be something quite alien to us, something that we wouldn't understand, or maybe something mental or something divine, right?
As you were inclined to be a skeptic, that's what seemed to be attractive to you.
I'm attracted to that. I am attracted to that as a serious possibility. Now, my gut instincts are more materialistic, but I think one of the things that, as a skeptic, I want to do is try to put back on the map other possibilities besides materialism that I think philosophers in the 20th century, there's this very quick shift in the philosophical community to materialism.
Scared by science.
Maybe, right? The nuclear bomb goes off and suddenly we're all materialists. So I think in that swift transition, we left behind a variety of other views that are worth at least still taking seriously, I think.